Let's turn to Job chapter 2. As the plot thickens in the story of Job, I was reading one commentator in my prep for this class who said that in order to withstand the suffering that is going to come in each of our lives at some point if we live long enough, it's important for the Christian to have a proper grounding in the theology of suffering before suffering happens, because he said that when you're in the midst of it, that's not the time to try to figure out what is God up to, or how does he want me to deal with this. So I hope that in this class, at the very least, we'll all have a better understanding when it's over about the theology of suffering. What does the Bible say about it? Because it's easy to get our thinking about suffering shaped by ungodly influences, sentimentalism, that kind of thing, which doesn't really help anybody. So, anyway, having said that, let's read, starting in verse 1 here of chapter 2. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth, and from walking up and down on it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil? He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. All that a man has he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, and he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. Then his wife said to him, "Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die." But he said to her, "You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place: Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. Okay, so here at chapter 2 starts out with almost a word-for-word repeat of what we read in chapter 1, when we were first introduced to God and his heavenly council, and Satan being there among them to present himself to the Lord to give an account of what he's been up to, again showing his having to obey God to a certain extent. God summoned him to be there, and Satan had to be there. He couldn't just say, "Well, no, I'm not going to show up as the angels gather together." And I don't know if maybe it's just me, but I find some humor in this opening conversation that God has with Satan, because it's like I said, a word for word almost of a recapitulation of their conversation from chapter 1. And considering what has happened here, of course, Job has lost his children, he's lost all of his livestock, his servants, his wealth. Kind of a big deal, but most of all, Job has not wavered in his commitment to the Lord. So Job has not done what Satan said he would do, which was to curse God. And so when God asks Satan what he's been up to, he gives this kind of smart aleck answer that he did the first time. Well, I've been here, there, and everywhere, and just kind of hanging out. And when he says this in response, since we know what has happened, it again, maybe it's just me, it strikes me as somewhat humorous that Satan is playing this game with God, because everybody knows what's happened, but Satan just doesn't want to admit that he's lost round one of this battle between him and Satan, and really between Satan and the Lord. So one of the things that's important here is in verse 3, God replies to Satan that he was incited against Job for no reason. He says God speaking here, Job, still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And in this, the way the English is translated, it almost makes it seem that God was tricked into doing this. Look, Satan, what you made me do. And I think a better way to interpret this verse so we can understand it properly is that this phrase "without cause" that God uses is the same word spoken by Satan in verse 9 of chapter 1, where Satan asks, does Job fear God for no reason? And of course, God is going to say, well, in a way he does, because he's not fearing me for what he can get from me. But nevertheless, that phrase, without cause, without reason, can better be understood by translating it to no purpose or to no effect. So in other words, I think the better way for us to understand what's going on here, God is telling Satan that you incited me against Job. I allowed you to do your worst against him, as long as you didn't kill him. And what was the outcome? Well, the outcome was that Job stood firm, and that Satan did not achieve the purpose that he intended. No purpose to no effect. Satan has failed in his attack on Job. Also in Proverbs 1:17, the same word is translated futile or in vain. So in other words, Job has attacked Job in vain. Satan has not won in this first round here. Also interesting that God affirms his sovereignty in that he was the ultimate cause of what happened to Satan. To Job. It wasn't Satan acting independently of God. God allowed Satan to do his worst against Job, and the result was Satan loses. In verse 4, this phrase, skin for skin, is one that seems like every commentator has his own interpretation of what that means. It's kind of a mysterious statement on Satan's part, so I'm not even going to try to do a survey of all the different ways in which that phrase is understood. But Satan admits here also that God is sovereign and that he, Satan, can only do as much as God is going to allow him to do. But he's asking for greater permission. He wants to do more to Job. Satan claims that if Job personally is attacked, if he personally is going to suffer, that's what's going to turn him against God. So we have God's response here that Satan can do that, but he can't kill Job. So this disease that Job is struck with, starting in verse 7, once again, it's another topic that commentators speculate on exactly what it was that he had. Maybe leprosy, but it sounds worse than that. Some think that it was something like the disease that the Elephant Man, if people have heard about the Elephant Man, he had this horrible, disfiguring, rare disease. And so some commentators think that it might have been closer to something like that affected Job. But again, we don't really know exactly what it was. Maybe it was something that, a disease that doesn't exist for anyone else other than Job. So here he is, an interesting development here that Job he's not at home anymore. He's not in his own house living with his wife at this point. He has been, in effect, thrown out of the city where he has been probably the most prominent citizen of that city. He's an elder who sits at the gate and passes judgment, makes decisions on things affecting the people of the city. And now he has essentially been kicked out, and he's sitting on the garbage dump for the city, which is where lepers would oftentimes go because they couldn't be around other people, or people who were just, they had some condition that nobody wanted to be around them. So this is Job now. He's out sitting on a pile of garbage and refuse and other nasty things, where everything is dumped from the city out here, and Job is sitting on top of this pile, and he's, whatever this disease is that he has, it's driving him crazy, and he has to scrape himself, I guess, to relieve the pain or the itching or whatever it is, just to be able to tolerate it up to a certain point. So here we have then the introduction of his wife, who has been variously referred to as the devil's advocate by Augustine. And I don't know if he was the one who invented that particular phrase, but he uses it to apply to Job's wife. Calvin called her a tool of Satan, an organum satani. Thomas Aquinas wrote, commenting on this text, that she was spared by Satan. Satan doesn't attack her, in order to be used by Satan in Satan's assault on Job. So anyway, here she comes after all this has happened to Job, and she encourages him to curse God and die, to do what Satan is trying to do to Job. She wants Job to do that very thing that Satan said Job would do if God allowed Satan to attack him in these ways that he did. She says, why are you still holding fast to your integrity? If you curse God, you will be killed, but at least your suffering, what you are going through, can come to an end. And Job rebukes her by stating that she is talking like one of the foolish women. And when the Bible speaks of someone being a fool, what is the Bible talking about? Who is the fool according to biblical? Right. So a fool is one who is an unbeliever, one who has not embraced biblical religion. But here Job says to his wife, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. So I think we can conclude here that Job's wife is not an unbeliever, that what she has advised her husband to do is out of character with her. She is not a foolish woman, but she is acting as a foolish woman would in this particular instance. So I think we shouldn't be maybe as hard on Job's wife as a lot of people, a lot of commentators are. I could only find one commentator who actually was somewhat sympathetic to Job's wife, and this was a guy, William Henry Green. He was a professor at Princeton Seminary in the 1800s. So he's a solid Reformed theologian from a previous century. And I thought his comments concerning Job's wife were enlightening, and I kind of liked what he had to say. It is noteworthy, he says, that Job's wife reacts as she does here only after Job's body has been attacked, and he's winds up here outside the city gate, sitting on the garbage pit. So even after her children were killed, and even after she's suffering the consequences of the loss of wealth, she still hasn't said anything until now, when she sees her own husband suffering in the way that he is. There's nothing to indicate to us that she has responded in this way until now. I don't think we should assume that when she lost her kids and all these other things happened that she was encouraging Job to sin in the way that Satan is hoping that he will respond. So it is not until Job himself, her husband, is suffering that his wife finally falters. So she kind of gives up and thinks that all is lost. Green writes this, and thus the loving wife, in the frenzy of her anguish, has ranged herself unwittingly upon the tempter's side, advising Job to bring God's judgment upon him by cursing him, and thus being struck dead. So if Job had just cursed God, God will kill Job, his suffering would be over. So even though I don't think we can certainly commend her for this advice that she gives to Job, I think we can perhaps understand a little better where she's coming from, and I think in a sense she's kind of a sympathetic character, not this horrible person that 99% of commentators depict her as this horrible person. And then finally, at the end of chapter 2, starting in verse 11, we're introduced to Job's three friends, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. So we shouldn't think of these men, these friends of Job, as neighbors, some people who live down the road from Job there, living in the same city. They don't live in the same city that Job is from. Eliphaz, the Temanite, for example, is Teman is another word for Edom, who are the descendants of Esau. I've tried to figure out if it's possible that Teman was the name of the place where they lived, perhaps prior to when Esau lived, but I really couldn't, figure anything out about that. But so if Eliphaz is a descendant of Esau, then obviously, we're talking in the first lesson about when these events might have taken place. So if Teman is synonymous with Edom, then we know that these events had to happen after Abraham lived, rather than before. But that's nothing we can be certain about. But anyway, Eliphaz comes from that area. It's south of Palestine. And then Bildad the Shuhite. Bildad is a name of Syrian extraction. So here we have Eliphaz is living in the area of what became or is already Edom. We have Bildad the Shuhite, who's probably living up around Syria, north of Palestine. And then Zophar the Naamathite, we don't know, we have no idea where he came from. But it's probable that these friends of Job are business partners. Job is a wealthy person. These three friends are probably also wealthy people who can afford to take a few months, if not longer, out of their lives to go and visit Job. Think of how long it would have taken for word of Job's struggles to reach somebody who's living in Syria or south in Edom, or maybe even farther east toward what would be Mesopotamia. But these men, when they found out what had happened to Job, I don't know if they all, communicated with each other to figure out, well, we're all going to visit Job here, because then that would add even more time, passing communications back and forth. So this is probably, this isn't like a few days later when his friends come to visit him, but more likely many months have actually gone by the time that Job's friends come to visit him. So Job has been experiencing the horrors of these events for quite a long time. And when his friends come to see him, they spot him from a distance, and he's so disfigured by his disease that they don't even recognize him at first. And it says that they raised their voices and wept, tore their robes, and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven, which means that they were throwing dirt up in the air and letting it land on top of them, which was the traditional way of expressing profound sorrow and mourning. And they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. So this, Job's friends are, they're another group of people that sort of get lambasted by commentators, by, if you've heard sermons on Job, when it gets to the topic of his friends, they come in for severe criticism, most of which is certainly deserved. And if we want to skip ahead to the final chapter of the book, God himself is very angry with Job's friends for the advice that they've been giving to Job and the things that they've been saying about God himself during this time. But let's say a good word. We said a good word about Job's wife, so let's say a good word for the three friends. They traveled at, I think it's safe to say, a great distance. Probably took weeks for them to travel from their homes to where Job was. And when they got there, they didn't start out with the pious platitudes right off the bat. They said nothing for 7 days, which was supposed to be the official time of mourning for somebody who's experienced tragedy. So let's say a nice word for his friends. This was their finest hour when they just sat there and kept Job company. So they did something right. And oftentimes I think in our own lives, when we know people who've experienced a tragedy, death of a loved one, so on, that oftentimes saying nothing is the best thing you can do for them, instead of saying something stupid or hurtful or unthinking. So I think that's good advice for all of us. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Chapter 2. Right. Could be, yeah. Makes sense. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Yeah, because cities would have their garbage dump where all the garbage and other waste would be dumped, and then it would be set on fire to make that pile of garbage smaller, and also probably act as a disinfectant to a certain extent as well. Jesus, during his earthly ministry, talks about, he refers to hell sometimes as Gehenna, and Gehenna was actually a real place right outside the walls of Jerusalem, where Jerusalem's residents dumped all their garbage. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was burning literally all the time. I mean, the fires never went out. You may have seen, videos of, very poor people who live in India going to the garbage dumps to, fishing around for something that they can use, clothing, tools, maybe some food even, and these huge piles of refuse that I'm sure is disgusting if you're up close to it, but nevertheless these people, this is the best they can do, to find things that they need because they're so incredibly poor. So this is, kind of an ancient practice that still continues today, actually, in some parts of the world, where there's no better way. The garbage truck doesn't come down the street and pick up your bags of garbage and then take it to the dump. all the garbage has to be dealt with, right where it is. Yeah, Maureen. I think he was, lepers had to, live outside the walls of the city. They couldn't be close to normal people, respectable people. So if he, in fact, had leprosy, if that was the disease that he had, which some commentators think that was it, that would explain why he was had to be outside the city walls, because people would run away from lepers. They didn't want to be around them. They didn't want to be, risk getting touched by a leper, because they thought that the disease was so easily communicated from person to person, although we now know that it wasn't. But nevertheless, if he had leprosy, he would have had to leave the city, and if what he had was even worse than leprosy, that would be even more reason for him to have to leave the city and not be around other people. We'll get to this later, much later in the book, but Job talks about people who walk by him and spit on him and make fun of him and do all kinds of terrible things to him while he's, on the garbage pit. People are walking by. Again, similar to Christ, being spat upon, being mocked, even though he was God's son. Just like, Job is, you could say, is God's favorite guy. There's no one else like him. But yet, here he's, given over to this situation where he's mocked, he's spat upon, people make fun of him, et cetera, et cetera. So, Howard, did you have a question? Yes, there's more than just this one verse here in the book.
She lost her children, and she didn't say that, but then when he got, his flesh became so bad.
Yes, yeah, I think that's a good point. Yeah. One thing to take note of is, even though Job lived during a time when it was not uncommon for a man to have multiple wives, there's nothing to indicate that Job had multiple wives. We just hear this reference in passing to his wife, singular. So another example of Job's righteous living and piety. Any other questions? Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Yeah. Okay. Let's get at least started on chapter 3 here, where after the period of 7 days that Job's friends have been with him, finally he says something. And I think it might be helpful to read the entire chapter, actually. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. That night, let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, that night be barren. Let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light, but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning. Because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept, then I would have been at rest with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together, to hear not the voice of the taskmaster. Small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. Why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. I've heard it said that Job chapter 3, by its very presence in the Bible, argues for the fact that the Bible is a divinely inspired book. If biblical religion was purely man-made, why would we even have something like chapter 3 in the Bible? But God in his wisdom has seen fit to give us this particular chapter to learn from it. Here Job, the first two chapters we've read that Job did not sin in his reaction to what had happened to him. Here Job sins. He's calling into question the very works of God. He's questioning God in a way that implies that God doesn't know what he's doing. If he did, then none of this stuff would have even happened to Job. He's, think of the context here. If it is true, which I think it is, that many months have gone by since Job was struck, Job has been suffering for a long time. And so now he gets to the point where he just can't take it anymore. And he has to give vent to his feelings of, he's frustrated, he's mourning all that has come his way. He doesn't understand it. His conception of God, his theological understanding, although it is great and deep, as we will see in the coming chapters, there's no place really in his theology for what has happened to him. Remember I said, I think it was in the introduction, Job and all three of his friends, their understanding of the way God works is that the one who does wrong gets what he deserves. The one who is wicked is going to be punished by God. They're not going to get away with it. So if you see somebody who's suffering, you can know that he's been up to no good. This idea of retributive justice, this is how God works, or at least Job thought that that's how God works, but at the same time, he knows that he hasn't done anything wrong. Not that he doesn't realize he's a sinner and needs God's forgiveness for his sin, but he's not done anything that could remotely cause him to deserve what's happening to him. There's just he doesn't have a category in his theology for that. And as we'll see, that actually is going to be the thing that distresses him more than anything else. He's wondering what God is up to, because he knows he hasn't done wrong. He knows that God is just, perfectly just. God is sovereign. Nothing happens in the world that lies outside of God's control. So, therefore, what's going on here? Job is he's at the end of his rope. He's not ready to curse God. He's not going to do that and bring upon God's immediate judgment. Of course, right there we have this understanding of retributive justice, that when you do something really bad, like cursing God, that he's going to kill you right away. But actually, we know that that's rarely the case. That's not what happened to Adam and Eve. They didn't die immediately. So this idea that if Job would just curse God, then his suffering would be over, well, that's not really a valid assumption for anyone to make, whether it's Job or his wife or Satan or anyone else. So Job doesn't want to kill himself. He doesn't want to curse God in spite of his being profoundly confused by what's going on. So I guess the next best thing from his point of view is, if only he had never been born, if he had never been conceived, if he'd never been born, or if he had died immediately upon childbirth, then he wouldn't have to be suffering the way that he is now. If only God could have done that for him, he would have been content. Okay, got about 2 minutes. Any questions, comments? Yeah, Kevin. Yeah. I think Job's sin here in chapter 3 and the things that he says, it's not that he's being brutally honest with God. To be brutally honest with the Lord is not inherently sinful. as you mentioned the words of Jesus on the cross, of course, quoting from the Old Testament, quoting from Psalm 22. I think that idea is, I think that's a fairly common idea that if you can't be too honest with the Lord, you can't really express what you're really feeling or thinking, because some of that might be impious on your part. But there's no biblical warrant for thinking like that. We have over and over again throughout Scripture examples of God's people, bearing their souls to the Lord, and whether it's confession of sin or maybe simply confessing that you don't understand what God is doing in one's life. We have the example of Christ during his earthly ministry. He was, of course, I think he knew better. He wasn't going to hide things from his heavenly Father as if he didn't know, but I think of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane when he's praying to the Lord, asking if there's any possible way. This is certainly an example of Christ's humanity coming to the fore. In his human nature, that human nature that is not omnipotent and it's not all-knowing, and so on and so forth. He's still kind of grasping, in a way, trying to figure out what exactly is going on, and do I really have to do this? And of course, he does it. He's perfectly obedient and faithful to what his Father has given him to do, whereas Job isn't, because Job is not sinless. He's not perfect. So he winds up where he is in chapter 3, and on that note, we have to stop. So, okay, Chuck, you want to pray for us?